in my lecture, I'm going to discuss reproductive isolation. And you may have seen in my lecture in class how when it comes to classifying different species, scientists have a difficult time doing that because it gets confusing or it gets difficult to say, well, where do I draw the line between like how much traits do I need to declare something a different species, or how much of a difference do I need to do that? So um, one of these mechanisms is reproductive isolating mechanisms, and in order to classify different species is reproductive isolating mechanisms, which is what scientists can sometimes use. And reproductive isolation is um, it helps prevent interbreeding between two different species. So here, why does it occur? Well, first off, you have populations. The populations themselves don't intentionally make these reproductive barriers. Instead, what would happen is genetic changes that would occur because a species becomes adapted to its own environment. And a lot of times these are because a species becomes adapted to its own environment, it like almost attains its own set of characteristics different from like another population, which prevents interbreeding. And evolutionary biologists call this a byproduct of genetic divergence. And what this means is that as time goes on, a species has its own unique characteristic, and some of these characteristics help it prevent breeding with other species. So, there's two methods to reproductive isolating mechanism. The first one is prezygotic isolating mechanism, and in this mechanism, you prevent the formation of a zygote, and that's its main objective. So there's 5 ways to prevent the formation of a zygote. One clear way is habitat isolation, and in this method, the species never come into contact with each other, so therefore preventing interbreeding. And this method has a lot to do with their geographic barriers. So for instance, you can have a large body of water that separates two different plant species that live on different islands. And because this water is like separating them, these two plants will never come into contact with each other. Therefore they'll never be able to like mate or interbreed or create different species. So that's habitat isolation. Second type is temporal isolation, and here you have a species or two different populations that can reproduce at different times of the day or different times of the year. So, for example, in the book they give you an example of two types of crickets called spring-field crickets and fall-field crickets, and the thing about these crickets is that they're almost very, very identical. They're similar. What they do is they have the same morphology, same habitats, same songs, but the difference is the difference between these two populations is you have the spring cricket mates only in the spring, whereas the fall cricket mates only in the fall. So because they only mate at certain times of the year, they'll never mate at like the same time together, and therefore they prevent interbreeding between both of them, and that's why they're considered separate species. So then you have your third type, which is behavioral isolation, and in this type you can have they'll give you another example in the book between two different birds called the western meadowlark and the eastern meadowlark, and for a long time they were thought to be like the same species, but now what happened is scientists found out that they're two different species for a reason, which I'll explain next. But the thing about them is when they go to mate, their mating calls are a lot different. So, like for instance, the western meadowlark has a flute-like gurgling noise, and the eastern meadowlark is just like a simple series of whistle that's like around 4 to 5 notes long. So through these songs, it's very distinct to which type of bird is, if it's part of their species or not. If they have similar songs, they're obviously from the same species. Different songs, they're from different species. So they're usually gonna go mate with the bird that has their similar mating call. So that's why behavioral isolation is a type of reproductive isolating mechanism. Um, so then you have the next type of prezygotic isolation, which is mechanical isolation. And it happens when you have morphological features like size, color, or you can have incompatible genitalia, which prevent the two populations from interbreeding. Like for instance, you have the male dragonfly. When they mate, they use a pair of special appendages that are used to grab the female while they're mating. And the thing about these appendages is that only these appendages fit the fit the body shape of like the same species of dragonfly. So, so for example, if he tries to mate with another female from like a different like uh from like the same from the different uh like a different type of female dragonfly, it's not going to work because his appendages would not fit her body. His appendages are not made for her, and that's part of mechanical isolation. So then you have the final type of prezygotic isolating mechanism, which is gametic isolation, and this happens when two species try to interbreed, but their gametes don't carry out their jobs and never fertilize successfully. So a lot of times in aquatic or marine environments, the water animals want to mate, so they release their sperm and egg into the water in hopes that they'll find each other and fertilize and eventually make babies. But you can have a different, like a sperm of like one species and and an egg of a different species try to like fertilize and create something called an interspecies hybrid, which I'll go over next. But what in order to prevent like the formation of the two different species or interbreeding between two different species, what happens is gametic isolation comes into play to prevent something like that. Like in the book they mentioned sea urchins. Like the male like sea urchin has a protein on its gamete called bidin, I think, or bitin, and what that does is it prevent like it's I want to say it's selective to only like the eggs of his own kind. So that biotin protein is part of gametic isolation because it would like prevent the interbreeding of different species. So then that's enough about prezygotic isolating mechanisms. Let's get into postzygotic isolating mechanisms. So unlike prezygotic isolating mechanisms where the zygote doesn't form, in postzygotic isolating mechanisms the zygote forms but never actually develops after fertilization. And in this mechanism, there's three different ways that this happens. The first way is hybrid inviability, and here you have the egg fertilized by a sperm, but it never actually develops past the embryo stage. And then in the second way, you have something called hybrid sterility. So you create what is called an interspecies hybrid, what I mentioned before. And what that is when two different species can actually like interbreed successfully and come up with an offspring. But what happens in hybrid sterility is that interspecies hybrid offspring, when it's produced, it's gonna be sterile, which means it can't reproduce further. It can't create its own offspring. A classic example of this is a mule. So here's a mule right here. It's made by the sperm of a male donkey through the egg of a female horse, creating a mule. So, how come the mule is sterile? Well, for one thing, a horse has 32 sets of chromosomes, and a donkey has 31 per set. So overall, the mule's gonna get 63 chromosomes, which is an odd number. And we know that when cells want to replicate, the chromosomes need to pair up. And how are you gonna pair up an odd number of chromosomes? Doesn't really work well. So it's not gonna be able to reproduce in that way. And another reason for this is um, that the horse and the donkey both have like structural differences. So the chromosomes, like I said, can't pair correctly, or they'll end up having like chromosomal abnormalities if they try to like um, cross over in meiosis and try to produce offspring. It won't work. So that way it would make inviable gametes. Um, Also, a mule is not a species because it's sterile, and anything that can't reproduce isn't considered a species. So then the final way is hybrid breakdown, which makes interspecies hybrids that are viable and fertile, but the subsequent generations are going to have detrimental genetic abnormalities, and that's often caused by changes in chromosome structure. Like when you have a chromosome of closely related species having structural differences, like in virgins, or in hybrids, you can have a crossover in an inversion in one species but not the other, and that makes the gametes have too little or too much genetic material, so therefore causing developmental abnormalities. So, yeah, that's all three of them. And just as a side note, know that post-zygotic is the most uncommon one because they say that it requires more energy to occur overall in nature. So nature doesn't really favor it. I mean, you've learned that if something creates more energy, it's not really favorable. And it takes a lot of energy for a female to produce um, a sterile organism, like a mule. So it doesn't, obviously, like, it's not really favored in nature. So yeah, and that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching. I hope it helped you.